Okay. Um, so again, I'm going to perhaps more concisely make similar points that I've come to recently about politics, which I mean I have articulated this point, but hopefully this will be much more refined. Um, Talking about the psychopathy and the lack of principles as being the cause, the prime um, constituent of what's wrong in our culture and our society. And you can see symptoms of this all over the place. It's interesting. I couldn't believe how much correspondence in what I was saying, in terms of, sort of the degradation of democratic literacy, um, as this kind of mob fueled, sort of morally murky and moral relativism, it gets to have its grift, um, respected by, sort of the news media, and by how everyone just gives this kind of cultural sympathy to it, so much so that even the people that go against it, like, in my argument, sort of are entertaining it too much because they are kind of fighting against it rather than just kind of pitying it as being fundamentally hollow and, confused and strange. But I mean, you can see parallels of this with COVID-19 quite explicitly, I think. That if you look at how much damage COVID-19 has wrought, as opposed to the self-caused damage of the economic and the mental health, and, the suicide rate, and, the economic destruction of the response to COVID-19, and you look at that from a public health perspective, you'll just see how out of proportion these things are. But also, this kind of this never-ending thing where you're never looking at something with a real principled sense of proportionality of, well, COVID-19 is never going to be eradicated. It's always going to be around in some form, and it's always going to have the ability of having variation. So are we all going to wear masks forever? I mean, it's kind of crazy. And never mind all the people that have died from hospitals being, sort of, like canceling elective surgeries and things like that, and other medical conditions, so there are huge costs which are hidden in this overreaction. And, essentially simply because we won't make a principled stance and say it's not for the politics of a government to tell people, I mean, this all started because China had a lockdown and everyone followed suit, and in some sense, politicians also, because of this cultural inculcation and this cultural slide into this kind of big brother sort of strange warping of the onus of proof and things like that, and basic principles, that in some sense, courts and a justice system should have said, no, this is not a political matter. The government can suggest that people follow certain guidelines, but they can't make it illegal to do certain things. They can encourage people to do things, but they can't enforce people. That we essentially, we do live in a free society. And in some sense, this is a stance now that has been so institutionally invested into that we have to keep on. We see it keep on doubling down. Like, when will the principles actually kick in, and the fear mongering, sort of be abated? That it doesn't, because there, yes, you can always hypothetically extrapolate that there's going to be some threat, that there's going to be some problem, and at some point you have to actually responsibly say, well, this takes us onto the path of a non-resolution. That if we take the super strict line, when does it end? Like, if we do this, what is the actual, what is the light at the end of the tunnel? It doesn't actually ever have a, it's an unbounded, sort of skeptical accusation, or a hypothetical accusation, and a hypothetical grievance that's based on a kind of, well, you have to prove a negative in order not to take that most conservative line, or something like that, rather than saying, no, I actually have a right to freedom of association, and you don't get to interrupt that right. You can suggest that I take it upon myself to curtail it, but you don't get to impose that upon me for this, never-ending, uh, uh, So in some sense, I think we do suffer from the fact that there hasn't been a mechanism to take this off of the political, to take this out of the political arena. But I mean, in some sense, it also, that's not necessarily, that would not be necessary if the culture itself, if the people themselves didn't have a kind of susceptibility to this, didn't have a vulnerability to the narrative grifting and the sort of, and the virtue signaling of uh, expertise. And I mean, there is a big question about how much sort of science and the authority of science has been abused and politicized. Um, Especially when you've had so-called scientists that have lied explicitly in order, because for the purposes of public health. And then you really have created a horrible, I mean, you've created in some sense a submodel of just how far we have gone away from democratic literacy, because how can you expect people to be even collectively sovereign if they are being managed and lied to in a kind of big brother Orwellian, sort of paternalism and infantilism? We've really sort of, in that whole drama, there is a metaphor of obviously proto-fascist, at least proto-fascist culture and politics. So that just shows, sort of how badly things have degraded. But this is what happens when you don't have an institution that is firmly tethered and grounded in principled thinking, when the principles are fast and loose and vague and murky, and then you just have, these really bad dichotomies. Well, if there isn't a lockdown, we're going to have more people dying. Therefore, government has the excuse, I don't know who I saw. Maybe it was Matt Welsh. I hope I got his surname right. Walsh, or it was somebody else who was quoting a sociologist, or some. I saw someone on recently quoting Anthony Giddens. Oh, sorry, I'm so bad at remembering names. who is a famous sociologist, and he basically gave this model that, I think it was, man, I can't remember the name of the model, but it's something like managing risk. It was a model about how, in some sense, government has a duty to manage risk. For that's part of, like, it's sociologically part of the basic sort of social contract, that we need a government to help us manage risk. But because risk is almost philosophically or fundamentally an unbounded um, as a subject, risk as a subject matter is fundamentally is beyond um, a kind of definitive uh, catalog. You can't condense all of risk, all of possible risks in terms of, you don't know what you might be facing or something like that. So because you can't actually know even the scale and the types of risk that might occur in now and into the future, that in principle government has the, according to this risk management model, government has theoretically the right to do whatever they want. That government has the capacity that it can infringe on any right, because it can be managing risk, or it needs to manage risk. And because risk is fundamentally unbounded, it could actually theoretically do anything that it likes, as long as it does so in the name of managing risk. And I haven't quite made, okay, yeah, I'm not remembering it exactly, but it's something like that. And obviously, that's quite a dystopian model to then sort of have installed into the political structure of your society. And I do think that it is something like a mini version of a kind of what I've called sometimes a kind of the Kantian paradox, is that when you try to institutionalize the categorical imperative, you end up undermining and making it impossible for the category, because if you have an institution that is tasked with such an important means of facilitating the categorical imperative, then it can do anything that it so wishes, because the means will be justified by the ends, because it has the highest ends and something like that. And so, but the paradox is that when you have an institution operating in such a way, it stops individuals from being able to use the categorical imperative, because it's more important that the institution ensures it and guarantees that they can do it. And so you end up with the institution having to creep into everyone's lives and everyone's minds, and everyone must prove that they value the categorical imperative by endorsing the institution that represents its deployment. And you end, it's a, I haven't explained that quite perfectly, but that's also essentially that's a it's a similar kind of thing. I mean, it's the same way in which Leninism gets its disgusting, toxic, sort of vortex, that how it spirals into itself, is that these things, and in some sense, I do think the solution is that you cannot ground things from the perspective of the collective. You cannot ground things from the perspective of the political group. You have to ground things in the individual. That justice must be not justice for the group or for the collective identity. It must be justice for the individual, which is also why I say that that justice can be properly framed and etched into a republic, and not into the democracy. That essentially the needs of justice is that the democracy must be curtailed, even to preserve to the maximum possible freedom of association and freedom of conscience, and which simply means that if one really wants to flourish, you don't do so through the state and through state institutions. You do so around the scaffolding of the state, beyond the states. That the state is not the conduit for, the state is maybe a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition, and it might also not even be a necessary condition in every case as well. I should point that out as well, but it can be a helpful reflection or something like that, or a helpful anyway. So I don't think I've contradicted myself, but anyway, but that's the kind of tension that I like to set up, that the state, it is good to have a good state. It would be nice to have a nice, well ordered, well framed state. And I do think it can make it easier to flourish, because it's in some sense, just because then you can have the well ordered state as a good scaffold, just to model one's own self-determinism, just to locate yourself within your environment in some sense. That you're not going to, a well-regulated, well-framed state will give you, hopefully, maybe an awareness between the multitudes and the little flock sort of thing, to dissuade you from depending on the state for your own purpose and creating a collective mob mentality. Sorry, this is very close to what I was talking about at the end of my last psychological recording is very much related to this theme that I've just brought up now. But anyway, I wanted to now make some remarks about the refinement of my ideas around the slide into a kind of psychopathic democratic illiteracy. That essentially you give up principles for crude morality tests and maybe even crude reality testing that is basically are bad reality tests. That you create dichotomous, factual, sort of yes or no sort of things, and then you kind of you sort people. And this is interesting. This is why Boris Johnson doesn't want, to necessarily commit himself to stopping the lockdown, because half of the population is going to come down on him, because they're going to say, oh, well, you want people to die because there's going to be, because you're not taking the most, you care more about the economy than you do about people's lives, even though, these people may have made all this cognitive dissonance, all these stark dichotomies of separating these issues. Like as if, well, the economy doesn't have a direct impact on people's livelihoods and their mental health and public health itself. It sort of makes all these brittle moral anyway, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance and confusion, but strangely there's no confusion around this dichotomy. Well, either you're a bad person because you don't because you don't want the lockdown to continue, or something like that. And this is generalizable, because this is how people lock down things with cultural sympathy and groupthink and bandwagons. That they are I do think they are almost also like mini versions of what I was saying in my psychological recording about that they are actually this is going to be weird to talk about in this context, so let me not make these esoteric sounding things about psychology, but basically they want stringent, strict, ideological narrative type parsing of reality, where there's a very clear moral narrative that is being unilaterally imposed, and it just needs to be followed. And there can be some small disagreements about how that recipe is cooked up, but as long as sort of the conclusion is the same and it's going in the same direction, you might be able to reverse engineer or to fiddle with the intricate reasoning, but in some sense it doesn't matter, because it just the means don't matter. It matters about conforming to producing the same ends. So in terms of the thinking about it is not important, but everyone must just do the same thing. And you have this whole project instead of principles and values, and coherent thinking. And so it doesn't matter that there's no coherence in this worldview. It just matters that there are these like little facts that amount to this dichotomy that are attached to this basic test, reality test or morality test, over this issue. I mean, this can also be connected with other things, which is, how people confront the concept of evil itself, how to get by in existence. how to get by in an existence which includes evil things. Sort of, it's a management problem. Sort of how do you deal with that? How do you, in your meta-morality, and in some sense these people have worked out that their meta-morality is basically, I would say, a groupthink, is a what Nietzsche would describe as a slave morality. But once this has picked up cultural steam, I guess it's very hard to disentangle it. But the other thing that I've been trying to fish for in terms of talking about it is that this is all hinged on a scapegoat. It has to be connected with a scapegoat. If it doesn't have a scapegoat, you can't get a sense of common directionality, because in some sense the outcome is only proven to be that we're all trying to do the same thing if we are all willing to throw the same person under the bus, if we're all willing to take a pound of flesh from the scapegoat, from the same scapegoat. And so in some sense that is, it's not about why we believe in that this is the right answer to the question. It's how we agree that it's evil that people that don't agree with us on this question are. That is the source of moral conformity and solidarity. That is the fuel of this form of toxic solidarity. And this is why, Boris Johnson doesn't want to be like Trump and just kind of say, no, there is actually a principled reason. And, this is why people have the kinds of remarks that they have about Trump, that, they say, oh, he's a fascist because he doesn't give good reasons, because, he doesn't have good reasons for anything. He just makes up things. Never mind that they can't see their own fake news, which Trump talks about. And they're like, he calls everything fake news that just doesn't agree with him. That's what they say about Trump. Because he just cuts through their psychopathic narrative grifting. He doesn't even contend with it. He just describes it from his point of view. He just labels them as being toxic and fake news. So like, he just labels them. He doesn't engage with them. He doesn't participate. He doesn't play their game. He doesn't play the tug of war with their fake narrative. He just dismisses it, essentially. And so they say that he is, sort of, he just makes up his own facts, or something like that. Whereas he just, which is also, sort of what makes him such, because he is a model of how you need to, I mean, in some sense, the only thing I would modulate about him in terms of how I would encourage other people to deal with these people is that you really should pity them. You should pity them that they have a narrative, that they can't break that frame. They can't think for themselves, because if they did, they would be cannibalized by their own groupthink and bandwagon, which they have to sort of be joined at the hip with. And in some sense, the only thing that can make them know that they have the safety of that mob is if they are conducting the same witch hunt against somebody else. And so when they come to you with their witch hunt, it's almost best not to fight the witch hunt, but just to pity them, I would say. Because I do think that their whole mentality requires there to be a witch hunt for a scapegoat. And it gets more and more obvious. I mean, so really, this is why the people that I despise the most and that I vilify the most are the people like Destiny. It's not the emotional psychopaths that are giving these long victim narratives so that they can get into the grift and that they can perpetrate this sadistically edged, sort of morality play and be, sort of the tip of the spear. It's the people who intellectually legitimize this bullshit. It's the people who help give prestige and the appearance of intellectual credulity, and sort of bring their, it's these little wizards, that are constantly piecing together. This is why I don't like it when Sargon of Akkad is debating with Destiny, because yes, yeah, Destiny changed his position. Destiny is now saying something that Sargon of Akkad said 4 years ago, that he's just thrown it in because it doesn't make a difference, because it's just like moving the deck chairs of the Titanic. It doesn't matter. It's just a performance. It's just a hand waving. Uh, it's just to bring legitimacy to the groupthink, to the witch hunt. That's all it does. He's just facilitating a service to his collective moral bandwagon, and universal narrative. Uh, and in some sense, what matters more to these people is the extraction from the scapegoat, because someone has to pay. You see this very much in Russell Brand. He's always about, well, don't care about them. They don't have power. Let's all just focus on scapegoating the 1%, because they're the cause of all the problems, and it's their conspiracies that have hurt us. There's no self-ownership. And I really need to get this clip of me talking with Good Mother and Billy, and Emmanuel, because Billy said these things that relate to this quite centrally. Um, but yeah, I mean, this is why I specifically despise the the news anchors that promote these intellectual, that sort of facilitate and give credence, or lend credence, and sort of how they puff up and broadcast this big brother narrative, and this, sort of the pretense of this cohesiveness, when they force other people to prove the negative against the narrative, because you have to prove the negative. It's never that they have to make a principled position. They just have to complain that the outcome is not good enough, and therefore we need to take drastic measures until the outcome is served. And the outcome is just by itself, and obviously, is just a token. Like, oh well, obviously there's inequality, so we must have people do this, never mind how unprincipled it is. Inequality, therefore we can do whatever we want, and you can't slow us down, because we need to do things expediently. Doesn't matter the principles that we step over, as they continue to feather the nest of this, authoritarian, democratically illiterate, sort of ineffectual den of corruption, that doesn't get anything done, and that creates more problems and creates more devastation and destruction, and because it just has no integrity, and it's so brittle in its own system of scapegoating. It's so ravenous, it's so bloodthirsty, it's so emotionally, dysregulated and hysterical, and the moral panic it just gets more and more self-delusional. And we're in the cycle of that, we're in the grips of that. But unless you reclaim cultural space with institutions that have real principles and values, and you exclude these people, there's no way. Unless you root this out, unless you find some principled bulwark to to preclude these people from playing their narrative witchcraft games, and setting up their strange, sort of, that you have to overcome hard skepticism before you can get your principle instantiated, because their outcome is so their risk that they are complaining about is so uh, uh, salient and overriding and pertinent. And this is what John Vervaeke would. I mean, this is a version of bullshit. Um, which is why I've found John Vervaeke's criticism of Trump whenever he does say things like this, and he calls Trump narcissistic and things like that. And I mean, I think that a lot of that is very overblown. I mean, yes, in his personal style, but in Trump's politics, um, it, yeah, I mean, maybe that's too intellectual for people to make distinctions between what he represents politically and what he within the context of the ideological forces and how he is relating to them, and maybe his personal style, which sometimes I don't think there is. Yeah, I mean, come to think of it, what is really that narcissistic about his personal style? I mean, it's direct, it's personal. When he communicates on a personal level, and he communicates in a very direct way, and you certainly know what it is that he is thinking. But I don't know if that's intrinsically narcissistic in any way. In some sense, if you disagree with him, he is giving you ammunition to disagree with him quite boldly, quite directly. He's telling you why he thinks what he thinks, and he's telling you his personal reasons for doing so. And so, you can very quickly know why because he is self-reporting. I mean, I guess you could say that there's a lot of emotional content there, um, because he is sort of communicating his sentiments directly, which I don't think narcissists actually do that. I don't think real narcissists express their sentiments. They usually express kind of objective facts. They don't express their personal views on things. They don't couch them as personal views often. Or if they do, they don't frame them in terms of their own personal sentimentality towards those things. Hmm. So, I mean, you might say that he tactically employs some. Oh, okay, this is a tangent, which is not really important. But there are people who have personality styles. I mean, I've been described as having a personality style that is. Man, I can't remember her name, but there's a psychologist who makes a lot of videos about narcissism, and she makes a distinction between people that actually have narcissism and people uh, who have, and I can't remember how she describes it exactly, that have a kind of personal uh, way of communicating, which is like, but again, I think that it actually, whatever that narcissistic vehicle, not vehicle, but sort of, as I said, I think that it can actually be a very, I mean, because uh, uh, it can be a way of being very direct and being very, I mean, obviously, for narcissists to do what they do, they have to sort of gain access to the levers of people. They have to get into their minds and they have to connect with them on a deep core level. And so people that have a narcissistic style but are not narcissists are people perhaps that are very intuitive but also direct, and are very in 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 the theory of instinctual variance, you know, that they sort of the one-on-one variant, which is also called the sexual variant. You get the self-preservational variant and you get the group variant, or the social variant. So you get three like strategies. You get people who are very individual orientated. I mean, they actually call them survival strategies. So the one survival strategy is that you make very strong one-on-one relationships with people. They call that the sexual variant, because you are good to relating and depending on people for your survival one-on-one, that you have very strong relationships with individuals. Another survival strategy is that you have good standing with the group and that you are focused on trying to aggrandize yourself and have good relationships with your group, and so that you use a kind of social politics or a social diplomacy of having a high status within a group context, and you use that to facilitate your survival. And the third survival, anyway, this is a kind of a, you know, this model, and then the self-preservation model means that you actually just are very embodied within your own skill set and abilities and physicality. I mean, people that have that survival strategy of that instinctual variant are very conscious of physical things, in terms of that they know how trapped they are. They know how many layers that they often record how many gates they're sitting behind. They know how many doors are between them. You know, they often track very well, you know, sort of how physically strong somebody is in relation to them, and how close they are to a blunt object that they could use to protect themselves. They are very sort of aware of these kinds of basic facts constantly. That's the sort of the self-preservation instinctual variant. But that they know a lot of things about their own body, that they are constantly keeping account of, that they're constantly tracking. Um, anyway, so people who have a narcissistic style are probably people who are the one-on-one variant, that they make personal relationships with people. Anyway, that's at least using psychology, or sorry, typology to and if such a person is going to make speeches to large groups of people, or is going to, you know, be asked questions about what they honestly think about other things, you know, don't feel they don't like saying things that don't resonate with them on a personal level. They don't like lying. They want to produce a personal, honest account that is sentimental and that they deeply believe or endorse. And so if they communicate that way, they don't want to communicate platitudes. They want to communicate. So if they have to relate to groups and they have to talk about things, what they will do is they will amplify their sentimentality. So they won't, like they will be saying things not to convey facts. They'll be saying things to convey their own personal direct belief about something. And so this is why I think Trump repeats the things that he repeats, because he is being authentic. He is communicating authentically. And so it does have this narcissistic style, but to call Trump a narcissist, I think, is actually inaccurate and incorrect. Anyway, that was a long tangent, but anyway, like in terms of how Trump deals with politics, I think he's perfectly appropriate, because he does actually represent, when he dismisses his detractors and he dismisses people as using fake news and peddling phony narratives, and he doesn't engage with them, and he merely dismisses them and pities them, although he doesn't actively pity them, but he does dismiss them, and in some sense, I mean, he does intellectually disdain them in that way. He gives them the cold shoulder. That it does create at least the most responsible political response that I have seen to this mob mentality, to this groupthink, is that you're essentially, you are saying, no, you don't hold any water, you have no principles and substance in what you say. So I'm not going to deal with your narrative. I'm not going to play your game, because your game, I'm not going to be forced into having to prove a negative. I'm not going to have to overcome hard skepticism to deflate your narrative. Your narrative is so weak that I shouldn't have to pretend that you're actually making an argument. It's a fake argument. So yeah, I think Trump is actually completely correct when he takes that line, and he is the only one in the West at the moment that is still on that level of authentic, real politics in some sense, in that it's not just being governed by this unprincipled nebulousness. And anyway, so the question is, how do you assert principles when you don't have institutions that are capable of talking about them in a cogent way, in a cohesive way, especially when you have a state that is kind of agnostic to those kinds of principles, like certain democracies are, especially democracies where the substance of the law is invented by the legislature, and you don't have a rigorous set of legal principles and values that is independent from the political sphere. Obviously, there will always be some kind of interaction, but that it's very lopsided in the American system anyway. And to some extent also in the British system, although there are some cultural icons of things that the government can't do against the courts, perhaps. Although technically there's no real scaffoldings or guardrail to prevent that, but in cultural practice there is, but it's kind of like an unspoken sort of jurisprudence, but or it forms part of the jurisprudence, but it's not etched into the framework of the system itself. Anyway, and if you don't have prime fundamental values and principles that are elaborated into a substantive enough and rigorous enough legal framework, you can't extract judgments that are going to help impose principles against the scapegoating, psychopathic narrative witchcraft that puts the onus of the proof on you to prove the negative and to overcome hard skepticism, just to not have them impose their big brother authoritarianism against you for their outcome, which has some hysterical moral emergency about it. Never mind them having to prove something about the cost which everything endures for them going their way, but they get to work out how the cookie crumbles. They get to divide. They get to hold the unilateral, sort of cleaver. They get to set the table. No one else. They don't have to engage. They just have a narrative. So you have a counter narrative. They don't have to prove their case. They don't have to make the argument. They already have the narrative. It's that's the crazy thing. And they don't have to establish it in front of you from first principles. They don't have to do that, because then they would see very quickly how their principles don't cogently correspond with their narrative, and how their narrative breaks down and how it comes apart and how it starts disentangling and becoming loose and strange. But essentially they've got enough intellectual people or pseudo-intellectual people, they've got enough mouthpieces repeating the narrative, they've got enough mainstream media people, they've got enough pseudo-intellectuals giving it credibility by just repeating it. But the conspicuous lack of principles, that is what needs to be. That's the only way to save any part of culture, is you have to establish a principled value, a cohesive value and principled system and systematized structure that is capable of protecting people from this mob and from this witch hunt, so that if they come with their complaints, they have to go through the process, they have to go through the steps of making that claim, and then it having to deal with proper contestation from the other side within a system of proper principles and values. You need a proper functioning judiciary anyway. But there isn't enough ammunition, because essentially you need a judiciary that's capable of protecting the value of principles themselves from the liberal intolerance paradox, which is essentially the toxicity that is fueling this narrative witchcraft, moral relativism and unilateralism. So you need something that's capable of being sensitive to that kind of toxicity, so that it can actually say, no, well, you see, you think you have a principle, but instead you have a narrative, and now establish that narrative from first principles in front of me, and then we'll see what the other side says about it, and then I'll make a judgment, and then you've put a barrier against their encroachment. Because if you just identify them and you seal them off, you're just going to have the same thing happen again in another guise, in another disguise. It's going to emerge the same thing. What you need principles and values, essentially. But anyway, and enough maturity and clear thinking that you can see through this stuff. But yeah. Anyway, I've just repeated myself on and on and on, and I don't think I've said anything that new or interesting, so